One of the myths or perceived realities is that you got to be rich to participate in charitable giving. And that's just categorically not true. However, it feels that way. This is one of the barriers that I think that I'm interested in breaking down over time, which is like, anyone can be a philanthropist. And ideally, you're starting to develop them as a philanthropist before they've got lots of money anyways, so that by the time, if they're so lucky as to get, especially extra money, it's part of what they want to do with it is to use it and deploy it in a smart way because they're already used to and educated in it. And they're able to sort of deploy it with a little bit more confidence and joy, which cycles around to participating more.
Hi, friends. Ever wondered how you could turn your big ideas into results? Together, let's reimagine a better sector, tackle systemic issues, and yes, raise some serious cash. Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. If you're new here, my name is Maria Rio, and I'm an expert fundraiser with over 10 years of fundraising experience on a mission to make sure that your organization gets the funding that it deserves. I have a really interesting topic for you today. We're going to be discussing how you actually can prompt generosity in people. So, can you teach someone to become a donor? And to have that conversation, I have John. Hi, John.
Hi, Maria. Thanks for having me.
So happy to. John, for people who might not be familiar with your work just yet, who are you? What do you do? Tell us about you.
I'm the founder and CEO of Charitable Impact. And Charitable Impact is a donor advised fund in Canada. And we're very much online. So anybody who wants to use a donor advised fund can create an account with us. We're really into participation and accessibility. So we don't have any large minimum donations required. So, anyone like my kids, for example, who get a charitable allowance from me can have a donor advised fund with us, despite the fact they don't give their own money away. So we're a really online, modern donor advised fund based in Canada. And I started my career in corporate finance, sort of in the financial services, valuations, mergers, acquisitions type of stuff. And then I went and did some similar work in one of Canada's big banks. And from there, I kind of happenstanced into working with my dad, who is one of the pioneers of charity law in Canada. So the culture of charity was very much kind of a family thing. But then professionally, I really learned my charity in working with my dad, and he's since retired, but where I went on to learn a lot and eventually founded Charitable Impact. So coming back to where I started, started Charitable Impact really because we wanted somewhere for donors to go where they can explore and carry out their charitable giving, regardless of what charities they end up wanting to support or how much money they give away.
Nice. And something that you talked about when we were talking about this podcast recording is how you actually have engaged your own family in charitable giving, especially your kids, and like how you're trying to teach them from very, very young people how to be, a respectable member of society that wants to contribute, that wants to engage, that wants to make the world a better place. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about that. And if you could tell our audience about why that's so important to you.
I think for us, it's just a family value. So it's something that we want to pass on to our children and hope they carry on. I also, given my profession, happen to think it's important for the charity sector to think about developing donors. What I'm concerned about with my own kids and also the greater sector isn't so much whether they have empathy, whether they care about the communities they live in. There's more assurance for that than whether or not they're going to connect their ability to contribute towards helping their community through charitable giving. So looking at charitable giving as a way to help your community out. So I'm more concerned both professionally and personally as a parent to kind of go, hey, charitable giving is an avenue for helping things out around you that you care about. There are certain advantages and some disadvantages to charitable giving. Can we understand those so that you kind of have that tool set as you grow up?
I think it's interesting because a lot of people in our sector, like a lot of them are parents and they're bringing up their next generation of ad kids and trying to get them involved. There is something different about asking your kid to like learn how to become a volunteer and come in like one day out of the year versus like trying to integrate it into your everyday life and making them a little bit of the decision maker. And I really like that Charitable Impact does that with not only your kids, which is great, but also with the everyday donor. Because a lot of people feel like I have to have $5,000. After that, I have to have $10,000 to be able to become involved in philanthropy. And even with endowment funds or most staffs, I would say there is like a high barrier to enter. Like when I was seeing this organization, she started an endowment fund. The minimum that you could invest was, I think, $25,000. So that was a barrier to selling it to the board because the investment also was not that high for the organization. So, have you seen a lot of people get involved because it's a lower entry point? Do you have a level? What does that look like?
Our level is $5 is the smallest donation you can make. But, there's also ways to use our system without having to donate your own money. For example, my kids receive a charitable allowance from me. So I put the money in my account. I get the tax receipt. I then send it to their account, their donor advised fund, and they can log into that and choose what charities to give to. It's probably smarter to say we don't have a minimum. That's our ethos and culture, but it's also the question why is because when we get back to this topic of developing donors, one of the myths or perceived realities is that you got to be rich to participate in charitable giving. And that's just categorically not true. However, it feels that way. This is one of the barriers that I think that I'm interested in breaking down over time, which is like, anyone can be a philanthropist. And ideally, you're starting to develop them as a philanthropist before they've got lots of money, anyways. So that by the time, if they're so lucky as to get, especially extra money, it's part of what they want to do with it is to use it and deploy it in a smart way because they're already used to and educated in it. And they're able to sort of deploy it with a little bit more confidence and joy, which cycles around to participating more. I understand why some donor advised funds have a very high bar donation to get in, but I think that where the donor advised fund is understood as a tool for any donor just to manage their charitable giving, kind of like a bank account is a tool for people to manage their economic life, then you make it accessible to everyone, regardless of how much money they choose to give away through it.
There's something that you said that I want to pull at a little bit more. You mentioned the idea of developing a donor. So, as a fundraiser, I feel like I'm very familiar with how to encourage people to give a gift. I'm very familiar with moving them from small to mid to major. But developing a donor, what do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Where I sit in the donor advised fund, I'm more interested in developing a donor from 0 to 1 or, to start giving, period, regardless of how much. And then the fundraising mindset can take over from there and say, okay, thanks for your $100. Can we get it to 200? Can we get it to 1,000? So on and so forth. So I'm really interested in how you get people to start, right? Let's talk about when there is lots of money on the table. If someone is wealthy, you have the advantage of saying, hey, there's this great tax benefit to giving. And that tax benefit is effectively immediate. You can donate to solve problems that aren't necessarily related to wanting to create change in the world. Now, ideally, those two things come together, right? But if the tax advantage isn't what's driving the donation, that's where I'm really interested in saying, okay, like, how do we get people into this world of becoming a donor? Let me give you two different analogies. If fundraisers are like fishermen, and they're fishing, hopefully they're good at fishing. They know where to fish and they know what kind of fish they're looking for, right? And they know where the big ones are and the small ones are and how to deal with each and, go here for salmon and go there for tuna. Okay. But what I'm interested in is who's there, like the fisheries department, making sure that there's always enough fish in the sea so that like you're not overfishing, you're not making it so that there's always an industry for fishing in the future. I'm interested in kind of going, well, who's out there looking out to make sure that there's more and more donors populating all the time so that, the fishing industry or the fundraising industry can cost effectively actually continue to fundraise. Another analogy is, sport. And I like this one because, I think a lot of people are born athletic, but what happens if you don't develop athleticism, right? So you can be born kind of athletic, but if you never touch a basketball, you're never going to become a basketball player. I think generosity, I actually think it's an innate human trait. Like we're generous people who like to help others, but you have to nurture that nature, right? So you have to develop that so that people know how to deploy it effectively and joyfully for themselves. And So I'll leave those analogies there, but that's what I think about when I think about charitable giving. And then I go, well, who is the fisheries department? Like, who's doing that type of work, or who's developing the donors in the athletic sense? If I want my kids to be active, I don't have to force them to play soccer. But if I want them to play soccer or they want to play soccer, I know where to just go and sign them up, and they get a coach and they see other kids doing it, and they hopefully have fun enough doing it, and they get into the game, and maybe they accelerate, maybe they try a different sport. I actually know what to do with them when it comes to developing their athleticism. With regard to developing their charitable giving, I don't know where to send them.
I think it's very interesting too that like we are so familiar with getting a second, third, fourth gift, but I have no idea how to get someone's first gift ever. That sounds a little bit unique or challenging. And I know that there's other like institutions, like we talked about religious institutions that are really good at kind of prompting that generosity and aligning with people's values in a way that shows them this is an adequate way to express your values. Nonprofits, we're sometimes shy with our values. So it's harder to like really know where you're supposed to be giving for that first initial gift. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I wonder, are there any like studies that you've seen or any articles that you've seen that kind of like do a deeper dive on that first gift?
There are some studies that are really interesting around, what happens if you do sort of teach giving. There's a study in the United States where they actually taught kids about the charity sector and giving and things like that. They followed those kids, and they went on to find that those kids were way more likely than others to give charitably, volunteer on boards, and do volunteer work and things like that. That's not shocking. Like, what happens if you don't teach kids engineering? We're not going to be engineers, right? Back to my sports analogy. If you don't teach kids how to play the sport, they're not just going to necessarily become it naturally, notwithstanding the fact that they may be born athletic, right? So I think there's some really interesting studies out there that have these very intuitive conclusions that say, like, hey, if you teach them, they'll do more of it. You mentioned religion. Why do religious people give more? Because they're taught about it, right? It's in their religious text. Therefore, they see other people doing it. So it's modeled for them. They then get to experience it themselves, right? They choose to, or they feel obligated to, or whatever. That gets into a deeper conversation. But regardless of it, they end up participating in it themselves. And those are the three key tenets of learning, right? Like getting taught something and then seeing other people do it and then doing it yourself. That's how you learn how to cook. That's how you learn how to play sports. We need to see some of that in the charity world.
I do want to make a small distinction that like we're not just talking about like people are less generous. I'm assuming that's not true. I'm assuming people are still very generous, but a donor is like specifically funding an organization. So they're expressing their generosity in that manner. They're moving towards like mutual aid networks or supporting their favorite influencer on Patreon. There are other ways to align with your values and to support the change you want to see in the world. But less people are choosing philanthropy, which is a very interesting shift. And I wonder what your thoughts around that.
Well, first of all, that's an awesome comment, Maria. You're totally right. There's more ways to choose to carry out your generosity today. Less people are choosing philanthropy. Why is that? I think it's partly an education thing. And then I think it's also partly because the competition, so to speak, like supporting your favorite influencer, some of those things you mentioned, is way more accessible, right? It's incorporated into how people live their lives way more than charitable giving is. That's a really important point to reflect on as a charity sector. This is why I think something like what Charitable Impact's trying to do, and others like us with the Donor Advice Fund, we come in there and we're saying, like, how do we just get you into philanthropy? Then hand it off to the fundraisers and say, how do we get you to give to our specific organization? And that's where I think fundraisers working for specific cause-driven charities need to, from a donor development perspective, start to get into conversation with donor advised funds and say, like, hey, we're fisher people. We need to be fishing people out cost effectively as possible. So how do we contribute to this conversation of developing donors to make sure there's always fish in the ocean? And likewise, from the donor advised fund perspective, donor advised fund has to come and say, well, we need donors to have comfort and enjoy knowing they can allocate their money to charities that are going to spend it well and create change in the world so that they keep coming back and doing it. And so how do we contribute towards that?
I also want to touch upon a little bit on DAVs because there's so many ways to be generous, like people giving at the checkout, people handing out cash to someone who needs it. There's like a lot of ways to be generous, but I do like that with your specific product, it keeps them a little bit longer in the sector. It forces them to think a little bit longer about where their gift is going to go. Although there are like a lot of pros and cons of having a DAF, this does push them to think a little bit deeper about their involvement in the sector versus just like at a checkout. One of my coworkers calls it a go away gift. Like, stop asking me, just take the money, right? But this gives you an opportunity to actually reflect.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And there are criticisms of donor advised funds. You alluded to hoarding funds and things like that. How I would translate that, and I agree with you, is like you want donors to have agency. You want them to choose to make this a part of their life. And so I think donor advised funds is a tool for that. For the core reason that you can donate today and separate that donation, that choice to give your money away from the separate decision of how you're going to use that. Which specific charities am I going to support, or am I going to give it to my kids as a charitable allowance, or some combination of that, right? And things happen in the world, and philanthropy should be viewed as a vehicle for individuals and groups of people to go to and say, okay, we've got some money set aside already. Maybe we should allocate it towards this because this just happened in our community or whatever.
Earlier in the conversation, you were saying, like, why is it that people are not giving through philanthropy? Why are they giving through other ways? And I wonder if other people who are listening to this podcast episode also have those thoughts. Like, how can I get more people to support the sector and understand the value of it? Because there is a lot of value between philanthropy versus helping in other ways. Like, for example, we are regulated, right? So we have to provide financial statements, we have to report on impact, we have to be fiscally responsible, X, Y, and Z, where, someone who is an influencer doesn't have the same kind of like regulations on them. So I wonder what your thoughts are for anyone who's listening, how they can start cultivating donors and how they can start cultivating a culture of philanthropy outside of their four walls.
That's a really interesting question, but here's where I'm going. What I want for my own kids, because we're talking about that a little, and to make it sort of personal to me, is I want them to figure out what I think I have done in my life, which was to connect what I love, what I enjoy, to like really getting involved with that. So what I want them to do is to focus on what they really love or they think they love and get involved with it. And that's where you start crossing over into philanthropy, because when you sort of say, well, how do I get involved with it? To speak some religious talk here, it's like you've got time, talent, and treasure, right? And maybe ties. Some people add this fourth T of like your social network. So that's really all you have. So how do you use those four T's, your time, your talents, your money, your treasure, and your social network, your ties, to create change in the world? And that's where I think you enter philanthropy. You kind of go like, okay, so what kind of change are you trying to create? And then, when it comes to something like mental health, or saving the environment or reducing poverty in your community or somewhere in the world that you care about, philanthropy is like one of the best avenues to choose. I mean, because you have these regulated, as you say, but organizations of professionals with a corporate entity that's custom built to run programs and create that type of change in the world. So it doesn't mean they succeed at this insane level all the time. It's not like every single time a chef cooks at a restaurant, they hit a 10 out of 10 on their meal, right? So charities aren't going to be perfect all the time either, but they're a dedicated, entity to do that. And not just generally speaking, like specifically, they're going to know more about how to carry out creating change for mental health than the average consumer on the street.
John, this conversation has been very interesting, and I'm sure it has people's like gears spinning because you're right. There isn't anyone out there other than maybe religious institutions teaching people how to be charitable and how to think of others in this specific vehicle. For people who would like to continue the conversation, where can they find you?
They can find me best through Charitable Impact. And there's lots of people at Charitable Impact who love to talk with people about exploring their giving interests. So, we're charitableimpact.com. And you can also find us across different social medias, at We Are Charitable. So look us up, check us out, reach out to us, and happy to have conversations like this and or something more specific to, whatever the person wants to talk about.
Great. Awesome. So I'll have those links in the show notes down below. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Maria. That was fun.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. I love what John was saying about thinking about this through a sports analogy or even just thinking about building that generosity muscle. So, how can we get people outside of our organizations to think of us as a social vehicle for change? So, I hope that gave you a lot to think about today. As always, if you want to see our lovely faces, you can watch this episode on YouTube. But that's it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, bye for now. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.